All right, here we are. Let's go ahead and get started. Interestingly, even with Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, that is not necessarily the most significant event as far as the church is concerned in the medieval era. All right? Technically, I think this event that I'm about to mention is even more significant. In the 11th century, smack in the middle, the church and all the tensions that have been arising between the East and the West come to a breaking point, and the church experiences a schism or a schism. It's like a divorce. It's like a divorce. And so it's a really traumatic experience for the church. Effectively, it divorces the East and the West from each other. Just to show you a map, this is kind of what it looks like. On the left-hand side, or on the western side of things, you have the Latin Church, or the Roman Catholic Church, still in effect, okay? It's organized. It's under the direction of one vicar or one pope, okay? And it's very unified. On the eastern side of things, you don't have Catholic churches, you have Orthodox churches, okay? And these churches still exist to this day, obviously. One of the interesting comparisons, though, is that the Eastern Orthodox churches don't have a pope, or they don't acknowledge the pope as having any kind of authority. Instead, the Eastern churches have patriarchs. And for as many nations as there are in the East, there are as many sort of hierarchies of church. So you have Greek Orthodox, you have Romanian Orthodox, you have Syrian Orthodox, you have Macedonian Orthodox, all kinds of different Orthodox churches, not as organized as the Latins in the right, in the West, but nonetheless still very much one Christianity. Okay, so that's what happens in 1054. This caused a lot of people distress, and so you had in the aftermath many people who were trying to revitalize the call to religious life and holy orders. One of the people to do that, to answer that call, was St. Francis of Assisi in the 12th century. He's a very interesting Italian man, okay? And he decides to form a group of people that will be known as the Franciscans, and it's an order of the church. Their primary objective is to be in solidarity with the poor, okay? St. Francis acknowledged that Christ himself was poor, and so that he needed to also represent Christ with them, and so he was in solidarity with the poor. In contrast to the Benedictines who lived in large monasteries, Francis was going to be a wandering priest. He was going to go from town to town, okay, spreading the gospel and helping others. Interestingly, the order that St. Francis founds, the Franciscans, is called a Mendicant order. They travel from town to town, and they don't rely on income from large tracts of land or vineyards or anything like that. They are completely poor. They renounce the world in all of it, in terms of its wealth. They don't even own the clothes on their back. So they're not allowed to own personal property. Instead, they're beggars. They beg. They say, okay, in your generous spirit, would you please help us continue our mission to feed people when they don't have enough food? And so that's why they're known as mendicant orders. They're begging orders. They travel from town to town trying to help people, but they don't own any large, vast tracts or terrains of land to draw income in from. Okay? Just to point out a few things about the Franciscans, Francis was not the only person in Assisi who had religious zeal. Clare of Assisi was also someone impacted, or someone who had a similar vocation, and she starts her own religious community in Assisi, which is pictured on the right. It's a town in northern Umbria in Italy. I put these two pictures here just to give you a bit of perspective. On the left-hand side, you have the Santa Barbara Mission in California, and on the right side, you have, not far from the mission, just like literally a block away, you have the monastery of Poor Clare, or where the Poor Clares live. You can still go to Mass every day here. You can still seek out spiritual direction, and they still offer classes. My point is, the Franciscans were very influential in developing the western coast. Okay? You can see they developed over 20 missions, all right, along the California coast. What's interesting is they are separated by about 1 day on a horseback from each other. So if you start out in the morning, you could get to another one by the evening on horseback. That was sort of how they sketched it. But these were centers of learning, hard work, and prayer. Okay, as I said, the Franciscans are still at the mission. It's been over 250 years. And obviously, the photo on the right shows you some cities owe so much to St. Francis, they even have been named after him, such as San Francisco. The second person I'd like to mention is Saint Dominic. Saint Dominic did not live in Italy. He was from Spain, but he does travel to Italy, okay? And like Saint Francis, he's inspired to not be in monastery, but to rather go out and preach the gospel to others in the world. He is also going to form a mendicant order called the Dominicans. Instead of just having solidarity with the poor, though, Dominic has a slightly different charism. He is also poor in a way, but he wants his order to be he wants his followers to be focused on good preaching. Okay, one of the reasons for this was I told you St. Augustine warned that when the church and the state become too intertwined, corruption can sometimes spill over into the church. Well, strong Dominican preachers were very good at condemning practices in the church that were not right. Okay? And so they needed to be learned and scholarly people if they were going to have effective teaching. This slide shows 3 separate institutions. Lots of people today have guessed that they were cathedrals or basilicas, but that's not quite right. They are, in fact, Europe's 3 oldest, most established universities: the University of Oxford, the University of Paris, and the University of Bologna. Dominicans all have a history at these 3 institutions. St. Dominic is not buried far from the University of Bologna, in fact, just across the street. Dominicans have always had a presence in Bologna. The University of Paris. Many famous Dominicans taught there, or, like St. Thomas Aquinas, was basically the regent or the headmaster of the University of Paris for 2 terms. So Dominicans have always been lecturers at the University of Paris. They're still there. They're still at the University of Bologna. Lastly, the University of Oxford. It's interesting. The Dominicans have not been there for the entirety of the time because they were expelled briefly when England, or not briefly, they were expelled for several hundred years when the English asked them to leave. It wasn't until the early 20th century that they were formally invited back. But the Dominicans were there and today proudly host what is called the oldest college or permanent hall at the University of Oxford. Okay? And so the point is, these 2 people really do transform Europe, just like Charlemagne did, just like St. Benedict did, except they had their own unique approaches and their own unique ways for doing it. With St. Francis, it was standing in solidarity with the poor, bringing the gospel to everyone. St. Dominic, it was slightly different. It was at the level of the university where he brought them, where his followers brought truth and reflection and contemplation. And so you can see sort of how Christianity is very involved in the formation of European culture. Okay, you can see that sort of being teased out in all of these particular structures. All right, that's what I wanted to present to you today. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay. Well, that's all right. So, anyway, thank you very much for listening.